Hey everyone. As a way to end the class, I just want to take 10 minutes to reflect back, maybe 15 minutes, to reflect back and think about all the stuff we've covered this semester. I mean, we've covered a lot of things, and I just want to do that as a way to kind of give you a sense of what we've done as you move forward, because I'm hoping these are topics that you'll consider to think about, whether you are a sports fan and it's in your consumption of sport that you think about these issues. Maybe you're an athlete and you want to keep thinking about this as you move forward playing sports, whether it's organized, whether it's more pickup games and less formal, or whether you're someone who still doesn't like sport and you're trying to make sense of it, right? Because this is a dominant institution in society. Now, over the course of the semester, the central question we've been dealing with really is that, right? We are a sports-obsessed society, and that's not just the United States, but a lot of our focus has been domestic. We've had a few discussions of more international sport, but most of it's been domestic. We are a sports-obsessed society, right? It's a major part of the U.S. economy. Over $40 billion a year is spent on sport-related things, and I think that number is actually growing. I should probably update it. I'm guessing it's closer to $50 billion now. 35 of the most 36 watched television events last year were football. Again, that's pretty insane. And then we also think that, well, this is something we want our youth to be doing, right? Over 5 million boys and almost 5 million girls every year are participating in organized youth sport. Organized, right? Not just going outside and shooting hoops on the asphalt, not just running around and playing two-hand touch football, but organized sport. Right? So we are a sport-obsessed society. Now, there are different ways to understand that, and I provided a few different tools or lenses to understand what sport actually does for us. So I want to work through those quickly, and then I want to finish by thinking about some of the paradoxes that we've come to over and over as we work through class, and just lay them out in a more formulaic manner. So in terms of understanding our obsession with sport, well, one way to understand it is the dramaturgical model, right? That was Clifford Geertz. He had that famous article. He's the anthropologist who had a famous article about cockfighting in Bali. Now, for the dramaturgical model, that's the way of thinking, well, okay, what's happening in sports, it mirrors society. It reflects society in that way, right? But it also teaches us something. It's a site where things play out. In that way, it's a model of society and a model for society. It's a text that can be read. That's the first approach to sport, saying, well, we're obsessed with it because it's the story of society. That's why it's so important. That's why we like seeing it. Second big model to think about when we're trying to understand this obsession with sport is the civilizing process, which goes along with this idea of sportization. Sport provides a needed release and excitement in an increasingly controlled and regulated world, but it provides a controlled space for that release of passion, of energy, of using the body, right? This makes a lot of sense, I think, intuitively, but it also shows us there's this massive historical process, and there's always this tension about, well, how much excitement is appropriate? How do you increase the amount of excitement by adding rules? When you control it too much, do you actually lose some of the effects it has? Right? When we think about sportization, we can think about Julie Kedzie and that question, I forgot who asked it, but the question about how much violence is too much violence, right? These are all questions about the civilizing process and sportization. Third model, and this is, we approach this through the idea of sport space, right? Sports occupy a very specific geographic and cultural space. You need a space for sport to fill. As it occupies that space, it fits a very specific class or social position, and it plays a role in reproducing the position we hold in society, right? So it tells us something about the people who are consuming it. To consume NASCAR is to do a different thing than to consume tennis, which is different than consuming golf, which is different than consuming boxing, right? Different people occupy these spaces, and those tastes tell us something about the position that we occupy. That's the third model for really understanding sport. All of these models are the basis for research, right? Say you want to go on and do something for grad school, for a paper for a different class, for maybe you have to write a thesis. Each model could provide a basis for an excellent research project, or you can combine them, but one is more than enough. Next model. It's all about achievement and competition, right? It's about competition between groups. We're trying to maximize what the body can do. It might be to represent towns, cities, states, nations. Maybe it's representing an ethnicity or a race or a sex or a gender, right? But it's all about seeing who wins. And we're obsessed with that achievement. We're obsessed with competition in society, which, going back to the dramaturgical model, again, tells us a very specific story about society. But that story is, it's an achievement and competition based model, and that's why we're so obsessed with it. Going off of that, right, still with this idea of achievement and competition, kind of the second part of that is it's about controlled and maximizing the body, right? It's about turning the body into this into this machine, being able to measure every aspect of it, being able to maximize every aspect of it. The goal is to say, what can we do with this body? And why are we so obsessed with it? Because we want to see what we can do with our own bodies, or what we want to see what the greatest bodies in the world can do. How high can they jump? How fast can they run? How well can they shoot that ball? How well can they evade that tackle? How well can they control that hockey puck, right? So that's the second part. It goes along with achievement and competition, but it's even more focused specifically on the scientific approach to understanding the body. Next answer, it provides a space for community. This came out when we were debating, well, why is it that we pay for public stadiums? And even if you argue that public stadiums should not be paid for, a key aspect of this discussion is this is a place where you can find community. This is a place where people of different political backgrounds, of different racial backgrounds, of different just tastes in general, or different personalities can come to get together and feel like they have something that they share, right? People can fill that stadium and watch that specific sporting event and talk to someone and say, I also share that excitement with you. I also root for the same jersey. Now, we didn't talk a lot about this, but there's one approach, and this comes from more of a Marxist theory in trying to understand sport. And I should say sport spaces also comes from more of a Marxist perspective. But in this approach, the idea is, well, it's a way to exploit and control the masses, right? You're providing entertainment that really guides energy towards something that isn't that revolutionary, right? Instead of turning up for that political rally, instead of heading to the factory to demand better wages, you turn on the football game, right? In this case, we're looking at European football, but you turn on that football game and you watch it instead. So it's one of the ways, it's kind of providing entertainment, the opiate of the masses. Sport could be considered one of the opiates of the masses. Another way to understand sport as an escape. Now again, this is different than the quest for excitement. Here it's an escape to something that has clear rules and order. It's about understanding purpose. It's about having a carefully defined space where you know when you're in it and you know where you're out of it, where you know what you're supposed to be doing, where you know who your friends are and you know who your enemies are, right? Everything is actually more controlled than this chaotic, confusing world that we experience. And chaotic and confusing in the sense of we don't know why we're here or what we're working towards. Sport is that alternative to it. Other idea or answer to this question of obsession and why we're drawn to sport. Flow, right? I think this is one of the weeks that a lot of people connected with, but it's the joy of mastering something. It's the joy of being creative. It's the chance to play, but also this tells us a lot about play, right? Play requires constraint and guidelines. It's the ability to creatively engage with those challenges and feel like you're building skills to overcome it. When you lose yourself in that, that's experiencing flow. And again, this is a critique of larger society. We don't have lots of places where we do that. Related is this concept of edgework. Edgework, instead of focusing outwards, as flow does, instead it's about testing what your body can do and the control you can have of yourself when you're challenged and pushed to your limits. Often this involves painful activities. So we read about it in the context of people training in mixed martial arts. You could think about, here's a picture of people training with stick fighting, a very painful activity, right? But this is this idea of edgework, being pushed to your limits, testing yourself, finding your body in that suffering or as you achieve confidence to overcome the obstacle. A lot of edge work is found in sports that are extreme, whether it's base jumping or skydiving or even these endurance hikes, right? Where you go out in the middle of the wilderness and or survival hikes, I should say, right? So that's a concept of edge work. It's a chance to actually test yourself and feel like you're placing yourself at risk. The thing we didn't talk about a lot in this class, other than through the concept of flow and edge work, is alternative sports, right? That's another whole area of sports that we didn't get as much into, right? People are drawn to this. Maybe it's about identity work. Maybe it's about flow. Maybe it's about edge work. Maybe it's about community, right? But that's another area to be explored. Not quite as mainstream sport. Not quite as not as much possibility for participating in high school, right, or college through organized events, but something outside of that sporting world. And this is an area that I'd love to talk more about, but again, we have the limits in the class. All right, so to finish, now what I want to do is provide you 9 paradoxes, right? Sport, I find to be filled with, it's really just completely a site of paradox and contradiction from beginning to end. And we've done a lot in these 16 weeks, more like 15, right? Because the first is an introduction. And I always enjoy teaching this class, and I'm really hoping this is what you walk away with, right? I've already presented some of the themes and lenses, but keep thinking about these paradoxes. Again, whether you're a fan, participant, critic, right? Keep thinking about these paradoxes, because this tells us a lot about society, and it tells a lot about our own relationship to society. First thing to remember, sport, right? We're a sport-obsessed society, whether it's money, time, identity, law, education, reporting, congressional hearings, etc. But the paradox is we don't consider it worthy of critical thought. We think it matters in the sense that we're obsessed with it, but it doesn't really matter, because if you talk about it too much, then you're ruining it, right? Don't talk about it so much. Second paradox, we love our athletes. We cherish our athletes often as much as our friends or even family, right? These are these people. We have posters on their wall. We read about their lives. We want to know where they came from. Yet, we watch them suffer for our pleasure, which is an interesting paradox. This is a group that we care about the most, but we want them to go out and suffer, and we want them to be tough and push through it, right? We're sad when they get injured, but we also want them to push through everything and have that success. We want them to perform for us. So we love them, but they suffer for us. Third paradox, amateur athletics. It's celebrated for being the purest form of sport. But as we talked about in the weeks thinking about college or even lower traveling sport, it's often the place where people get exploited the most. It's free labor at the very basic level, and the athletes themselves are incredibly disposable and don't have a lot of way to fight back. So it's the purest form of sport because it's just about the sport, supposedly, but it's also the place where we see potentially the most exploitation. Next paradox. Sport challenges our understandings of gender and race, right? Sport is this place that can show that what the woman's body can actually do, right? That it can perform at an incredibly high level that very few men would be able to achieve, right? That's pushing against our understanding of gender. It's pushing our understandings of race, showing that the white body is not necessarily superior, right? Pushing back against those ideas, pushing and showing how bodies of different racial or ethnic backgrounds can perform in creative and beautiful and artistic and intelligent ways, right, across the racial spectrum. So we can see how it pushes and challenges understandings of gender and race, but it also is a site that reinforces and confirms lots of these ideas. And sport in many ways has been traditionally conservative. You only have to look at the history of the NFL draft and specifically the position of quarterback to see the racial hierarchy being assumed and reproduced over and over and over. Next paradox. Sport is the place where sex matters. Right? This is one of the few places where we say we're going to determine the sex of the participant and we're going to organize the event based on the sex of the participant. But in doing that, the paradox is it also reveals how difficult it actually is to enforce the biological binary. It's the place where we care the most arguably about that binary. It also shows the place where it's the most difficult to enforce. The other thing to think about, actually I'll come back to this one a little bit. Next paradox, paradox 6. There's not supposed to be politics in sports. It's a sacred space, right? It's apolitical. And yet, the paradox is we know sport is always a political tool. It's always a political activity on some level. And it actually has more power as a political tool when people think about it being apolitical, right? The national anthem means more when it's about being patriotic, but not a political event. The politician being there, it helps them more when you don't think about them being there for politics. They're doing it because of the love of sport. Next paradox. Sport is the place where we celebrate fair play, where everyone follows the rules, where there's not cheating, right? Where you don't do things like take PEDs. Yet, we also know it's always about inequalities at the individual and structural level. It's about some bodies having more natural advantages than others. It's about people having better coaching than others, better nutrition than others, right? So it's about fair play, but also we know there's all those inequalities hidden behind it, or even hidden right in front of us in plain sight. Next thing, sport's about play. It's one of the few places where you can play and have fun, right? That's one of the things that draws us to it. We can have excitement. We can have joy. And yet, it's also about achievement. It's about playing the game right to win. It's all about winning. So These two things are at odds with each other, and we can see that tension play out constantly in how we respond to children playing, in how we respond to ourselves playing, in how we respond to athletes on the field, maybe doing something creative that doesn't help them. It's not a winning play. Is it about play or is it about achievement? And then a final paradox, and this is again something we see out playing constantly as fan of sport, is it about this pure contest or is it about the spectacle, right? What are we actually seeking out? What do we want those athletes to provide us? What do we want the institutions that give us sport to actually provide us, right? Is a boxing event just about two people boxing? Or is it about the show all around it? Is it about seeing celebrities in the crowd? Is it about the hype that gets built as a two people trash talk, whether it's real or not, right? So sport is a contest, sport is a spectacle. That's the final paradox. So I am going to end there. I'm hoping that through through taking time to walk through all these different approaches, these different lenses, it can remind us of all this stuff that we've covered in class, which has been a lot. And then I'm hoping through walking through those 9 paradoxes, it gives you those things to continue to pay attention to as you move forward, just as a citizen in society, as someone who has some relationship to sport. So, all right, that's it.